Hello, I'm Lauren and welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video, I'll be showing you how I made Galadriel's armor from the new Rings of Power series. With a lot of trial and error, this build took me about 5 months to make, starting immediately after the first Vanity Fair photo of this armor came out in February. Hopefully, with the help of this video, you can make yours much faster. Without further ado, let's jump into it. I started by using saran wrap and duct tape to make a pattern for the breastplate. This is a really common way to make custom patterns that are perfect to your body, and it's how I made almost every pattern for this entire build. Once I sketched the outline onto the tape, I cut myself out of my duct tape prison and cut out all of the pattern pieces to transfer onto foam. I originally thought this foam breastplate was going to be like the final version of it, so I put a lot of effort into making it look nice, and then I ended up using Worbla to cast over it anyway, so it didn't matter that much in the end how nice it looked, but if you want to do it fully in foam, this is what you would do. I took a Sharpie and drew out the intricate design that was on the front of the breastplate. At the time that I made this, there was only one reference image, this one. So I just kind of assumed that the same pattern was on the back, so that's what I did. I just slightly modified it to not have the star design in the middle. And here's what that was looking like when it was all drawn out. Okay, I was so nervous for this step, but I then moved on to using foam clay to carve out all of those raised lines. I started on the back because I didn't know what I was doing, and I'm glad that I did because by the time I got to the front, I was much better at it. The way I did it, I would sort of take little clumps of clay at a time. I would knead it between my fingers to get the air bubbles out, and then I would place it onto the foam base and then sort of pull those little clumps between my fingers to get those raised peaks that are on the lines. It's okay if your lines aren't perfect. I did go in later with my Dremel tool with like the little sphere shape tip, and I smoothed out all of those edges once the foam clay was dry. It was at this point I had a really hard time moving forward because I just couldn't get the breastplate as smooth as I wanted it to be and, to look believable as metal. And even I tried using Flex Bond to try to smooth everything out, but it was having a bad reaction with the foam clay. So I had a hard time figuring out what to do next. But this is when I had my big Worbla breakthrough. I had never really worked with Worbla before, but I did have a large sheet of it, so I thought I would just try to form it over the breastplate to see if I could get, that smooth finish. So I tried it to see if it would work, and it did! Oh my god, I was so excited. The result was beautiful, and it was way more believable as like a hard metal finish. To do this, I just laid the Worbla sheets over the breastplate and used my heat gun to heat up small sections at a time until it was soft enough to start forming over the foam. I very unfortunately didn't have a big enough piece of Worbla for it to cover the front piece, so I had to kind of use leftover scraps to patch that together and make it big enough. However, I would highly recommend to use a piece that fully covers like whatever you're doing, because this did end up cracking and breaking in these spots because I didn't reinforce them, and so I had to fix them later, and that was a big bummer. Here, I'm just sort of trimming those excess pieces and, trimming the Worbla down enough to make it workable around my breastplate. Here you can see I'm sort of patching up and smoothing out those patched sections because they were a little bit wonky, so I just took my Dremel tool with the sanding drum and smoothed those out. And here's how it was all looking when I was done with that part. Next, it was time to prep for painting, so I used several coats of Flex Bond just to smooth out the breastplate. I didn't show it, but you should use high grit sandpaper and water between coats to smooth out your brush stroke lines. After that, I hit it with a couple coats of Plasti-Dip because that's what I usually do for all of my foam builds, but I think I messed up here because it did end up peeling up later because there's so much armor on this piece that there's a lot of that's rubbing against each other, and it did sort of peel up the Plasti-Dip. So I think if I did it again, I would just do the Flex Bond and not the Plasti-Dip. For the paint job, I used a mixture of 2 of the Plaid FX line. They're flexible metallic paints. I just mixed those together, watered them down, and then airbrushed them onto everything. Here's the before and after. Oh my god, I was so excited. To add dimension, I used a black oil paint on sort of the underside wherever a shadow would naturally hit. I used a brush to just paint that on, and then I wiped it almost all the way off. The difference is really subtle, but it really helps to kind of give it that oily metal look. I also went in with a bright silver paint and sort of just dry brushed that onto any raised edges just to give it even a little bit more dimension. The last thing I needed to do for the breastplate was make the little star in the center. My husband modeled and 3D printed it on our resin printer. I then just had to hit it with a coat of gold spray paint. I glued the gem in the center and I affixed it into place. And with that, the breastplate was finally complete. Next, I moved on to the arms, starting with this shoulder piece. I just used the same saran wrap and tape method to make this pattern. I transferred my pattern onto foam and assembled all the pieces. This ended up being the only piece of the costume that I didn't make out of Worbla, like make a Worbla version, because I started making these before I finished the breastplate, and then I didn't feel like going back and fixing it. So I just processed them like a normal foam piece, but if you do continue with the Worbla method, you'll just finish them the exact same way that I did the breastplate. I then patterned out the upper and lower arm sections and transferred those onto foam. These pieces were pretty simple in shape, but I did forget to film a step where I used my Dremel tool to make these long, sort of hammered lines that you can see in the original photo. You can see it a little bit better in this step when I'm heat forming the Worbla over it. It's a pretty subtle effect, but it adds a lot to make it look like metal. I then just used magnets and Velcro to close the bracer pieces. Definitely one of the hardest pieces of this build was the elbow piece. Oh my god. Not only did I not really have any photos of what it looked like, but it was just a really challenging shape to make. I tried about a million methods to make this piece, and I ended up actually using clay and molding the whole piece and then casting Worbla over that when it was dry. It was really tricky to keep that shape and get the bend that goes all the way around the elbow, but I finally got it and it was good enough. Now that the show is out and I've actually seen, the armor in action, I can see that my guess on the design wasn't quite right. So I might remake this piece at some point just to make it a little bit more screen accurate, but I'll probably do it the same way. I don't have a ton of footage from when I was making the legs, only because it is just the exact same process of everything else, and it was getting hard to remember to film because I was just doing the same thing over and over and over again. But, for the sake of recapping it, I made all the patterns using tape and saran wrap, I transferred in foam, I cast in Worbla, priming and painting is all the same. My first attempt at making everything from the knees down was total guesswork, but they finally released a second photo that I was able to get a little bit closer with the knees and the shins and the shoes. And here are the legs all assembled before I painted them. The final big piece to tackle was the hip and chainmail skirt piece. I did the hip pieces just like everything else. I got to get the foam clay back out and do these raised lines just like I did on the breastplate, and I cast those in Worbla. For the chainmail, I was very fortunate to be gifted this large butcher's apron, which is just made of the same tiny chainmail rings that they used for Galadriel's armor. So you can see I started with this giant piece, and I really used every piece of that to, just kind of dissect and get what I needed from it. There's this one big piece that stretches across the opening panel of the skirt, and then sort of a pleated section that goes on top of that. I have now seen in the show that it does wrap all the way around, but I didn't have enough when I was making this, and I couldn't see the back anyway, so if you have enough, you can take this chainmail all the way around the back of the skirt as well. I had a lot of fun distressing the chainmail on this piece. I just used these little clipper tools, and I took out rings until I was satisfied with how it looked. You can see what a difference it makes from the distressed side to it just being totally flat. It just adds a lot to it. I did the same thing with the sections that hang off of the bracers. I just sewed the chainmail onto strips of fabric and glued those to the inside and distressed those as well. Here's a bit of a better look of me clipping out those rings to give it that distressed look. It can be hard to make things intentionally look unintentional, so it was a lot of just playing around with it and seeing what I liked and having longer dangly bits and holes and just kind of, playing around with that distressing. I used this method to do the bits that were hanging off the shoulders and the pieces that sort of hang outside of the pauldrons as well. One of my favorite details is the crystals in the chainmail. I wish I had used a little bit of a smaller bead, but I just hand sewed these on randomly throughout the chainmail. And finally, I attached the skirt and the hip pieces to a leather belt that I made. This is one of the first times I was trying it on with the chainmail, so I was very excited. And with that, this build is complete. I'm so proud of how this costume turned out, especially given how few reference photos I had while I was making it. I will have the 3D print file for the sword we made linked in the description. Please keep in mind we made it with almost no reference photos, so it's not 100% accurate. I really hope this tutorial can help you in some way if you decide to make Galadriel's armor, and please comment here on YouTube or message me on Instagram if you have any other questions. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.